So hello there and welcome to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 Podcast, the show where we take all of the latest news, gossip and events in the world of Formula One and we relay that back to you for your listening or viewing pleasure, depending on which platform you choose to follow us on. And we're now 7 races down in the Formula One calendar. We're in the second leg of our triple header, going, of course, to the Styrian Grand Prix in Austria, the first of the double header in Austria, the Styrian Grand Prix taking place in Austria. And of course, this time next week, we will be having the Austrian Grand Prix in the region of Styria. Confusing? Maybe, but we're not going anywhere. Of course, we're going to be having 2 races at the same venue. And joining me to discuss all of the latest news roundup and the talking points going into the Styrian Grand Prix is my co-host, Mr. Courtney Pine. Courtney, how are you doing this evening? You okay?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, life's treating me fairly well at the moment. Can't complain. Well and truly caught up in the football hype, but also the Formula One hype. I think we've got some true battles in both sports. We have a lot to look forward to at the moment, Adam. It's been missed through the
absolutely,
old COVID
yeah.
thing.
No, absolutely right. And I mean, of course, we've got some big news to discuss regarding, if you like, COVID in that regard in terms of the British Grand Prix. We'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, I must say it's, positive times. Of course, last week was a bit of a lull owing to some stuff in the news over in the UK. And things seem to be perking up. Of course, you've mentioned the European Championships, which we've mentioned as a footnote a few times in this podcast. For those of you that don't know, we are based in England, London, to be specific. So, of course, we do have an invested interest in the tournament as a proud Englishman, if you like. But, it's coming home and all of that. We've navigated the first part. We'll have to see how Gareth Southgate and his young Lions fare in the next round. Of course, the mighty Germans, no less. So, a bit of revenge, I think, is in store for that game. For anyone who remembers the World Cup match in 2010, in South Africa, of course, remember why we're seeking revenge in that match. So, but of course, yes, we'll have to wait until Tuesday to find out how we fare and if we continue in the tournament. And of course, we all know it's coming home. So, of course, we will. But that being said, loads of our foreign listeners and subscribers are probably unsubscribing as we speak. So, but I wouldn't blame you either. But nonetheless, of course, let's get into the news with Formula One. Now, of course, before we do this, just want to say, guys, thank you to everyone who has subscribed to the channel recently. Of course, the last couple of months have been amazing for the YouTube channel, but we're very much coming close to our 400 milestone. So if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. Of course, we've got more content planned for you in the near future. I know we keep saying we're going to make this video, we're going to make this video. That is in the pipeline. We haven't forgotten about it. It's just obviously other occurrences in our life and other priorities have had to take precedence in this case. And of course, we will be focusing on the extra content very, very soon. I've got a few ideas, got a few things in the works at the moment as we speak. So it will be coming soon. So do bear with us on that one. But yes, please do subscribe to the channel. Help us get to 400. Of course, we'll be chasing the 500 milestone very soon. But let's get into a little bit of a news roundup. Now, of course, because it's a triple header, that doesn't mean that the F1 news has decided to take a backseat whilst the Grand Prix are going ahead. There is still plenty going on in the background, which, of course, we need to find an opportunity to talk about. So we're going to do that in this opening part of the episode. And, of course, after that, we will go ahead with the Styrian Grand Prix preview. So the first news I wanted to talk about, Courtney, and we alluded on this a little bit in the last episode, our French Grand Prix review, was the changes that were reported that were going to be made to the layout of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. Now, the circuit organisers have said that work is going to be commencing in the summer, so probably anytime soon if you think about it, and will be completed at the Yas Marina circuit just before the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix later in December this year. So that's really, really good news because I think a lot of F1 aficionados, hardcore fans will probably agree that it's a circuit that has so much going for it in terms of the venue, the time of the season it is, obviously what it means for the end of the season, how it can be the scene for a championship finale. Hopefully that will be the case this season. But ultimately, the track does not present many opportunities to create great racing and has often been criticized for being quite boring and for a track that's had a layout that's just really restricted overtaking opportunities, especially in the modern era where it's so much harder to overtake than it has been in the past. That being said, that have obviously, the circuit organizers have listened to the fans and the experts alike, wherever they may be, and have agreed that changes will be made to the circuit. And I'm just going to go for a few bullet points of which changes that they have described, or at least inferred to so far. And so in this video, they have mentioned that they're going to be eliminating the chicane at turn 7, so widening the hairpin at turn 7. And I think for those of you that obviously haven't seen the video, it's the area of you've got the first few corners where it's quite fast and flowing, that long right-hander which leads to the chicane. That chicane is going to be removed now, and it's going to be a much wider turn 7, which I think we agree would be a great place to overtake in. They're also now going to be removing the sharp corners at turns 11, 12, 13, and 14. It's just going to be one long banked turn, which I think, as well as safety, is always going to be a good thing and a great overtaking opportunity. And it's going to open up the radius at the final 4 corners in 17, 18, 19, and 20, that twisty, tight final sector, which of course is great to watch in qualifying, but in the race, it's almost a bit like a dead rubber and there's not really much going on. So plenty of changes promised. Courtney, have you seen the video that they put on their social media page at Jazz Marina? What do you think of the changes they're proposing? Do you think it's going to create more overtaking opportunities? And overall, do you think it's going to create a better race?
What I find encouraging is that, as you've already stated, they seem to be listening. The event organisers seem to be listening to the fans, because I think that's been probably the biggest gripe the fans probably have about Formula One in general right now, is the modern circuits. The modern circuits tend to lack a lot of fault, really. They just plonk a Formula One track in a country that's like recently found wealth, and then the races themselves aren't very interesting. But they seem to be listening to the fans' frustrations about the circuits, and they're making changes to make the racing more interesting. Because look, we know Formula One's very political, and that's not going to change. But as long as they make the racing more interesting, because that's what we're tuning in for. We're not tuning in to see Formula One praise countries for their wealth. We're not here to watch that. We're here to watch racing. And the fact that they're actually thinking about what's going to entertain the fans more is very encouraging moving forward, because the criticism that Formula One gets is that the event itself isn't interesting enough. And changes like this will certainly help the sport grow in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think Abu Dhabi has been the season finale for well over a decade now. I think since 2010, it's been the final race of the season. And never in that time would I say I've seen an Abu Dhabi Grand Prix that is gone down as an absolute classic. I think the only example I can think of, or two of them, if you like, were 2010 when Sebastian Vettel won the World Championship. And that was more down to Fernando Alonso being so unfortunate for Ferrari not being able to take it. And 2016 when Nico Rosberg was obviously really put under huge pressure at the very end of the race to try and win the World Championship. And of course, Lewis Hamilton quite famously trying to back his own teammate up into Vettel and Verstappen in an attempt to try and win it himself, despite Mercedes pleading with him not to do that. And you know, that's all fine and well, but we obviously want to see Grand Prix races that are going to provide excitement, are going to provide opportunities for optimism, you know, places that we're actually going to look forward to watching. And I think this season, we've seen that so many venues, through one way or another, provide so many memorable moments, so many exciting races. We even had one at the French Grand Prix. I mean, that just shows how well how well this season has really gone in terms of a spectacle perspective. But you feel like more is going to be needed for something like that to happen at a place like Abu Dhabi. Now, you've mentioned, Courtney, that there are other circuits, of course, for whatever reason, you know, a lot of investment has been found in certain areas of the world. You know, we're going to Saudi Arabia later in the year. Obviously, we were going to have a race at Vietnam, which of course hasn't gone ahead and probably won't go ahead, unfortunately. We've had races at Singapore, which have majority of the time have always been great races, despite the limitations that are at Singapore. It's proven to be one of the spectacles on the calendar now. It's been so successful. Bahrain, another circuit that has proven to be successful on multiple layouts, not necessarily the endurance car layout that took over 2 minutes, you know, but the Sakir layout that we had, you know, despite being a shortened lap, still proved to be a great race to watch. And, you know, that's so important for the future of the sport. And I think we can all agree that the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix as a circuit is not going anywhere. There's not going to be plans to not go there anymore. And then all of a sudden we go back to somewhere like Suzuka, where we used to finish seasons traditionally, or Brazil, if you like, or even Adelaide, for those of you that would remember that far back, or Jerez, for example. We're not going to be going anywhere like that anytime soon. So it's critical that changes have been made or will be made to this circuit. And I hope it produces the desired outcome. I'm usually skeptical about these things, but you know what? If they're willing to make the changes and some of the stuff that they put down does seem like good ideas, then hopefully it will provide the desired outcome.
Well, yeah, because if you think of Formula One growing as a sport, let's be honest, the majority of fans are drawn to Formula One in the first place when they catch a classic race with plenty of overtaking and, big events with crashes and stuff like that. So the people that might criticize these changes that have been Formula One fans for a while, they might forget that we first got into Formula One because we were inspired by a good race. The sort of things that we love about Formula One now have developed over time. You have your favourite teams, your favourite drivers. When you get into the technical side, the car development, that all comes after your original attraction to the sport, let's say. And it all comes, we could probably think of races, because I know you've been very vocal about the first race you watched that got you into Formula One. And we need to be thinking about younger fans, children, and some people have been a little bit curious about Formula One. If they see a classic at Abu Dhabi, that's going to bring in more fans. So I think these changes are very good for the sport.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does for all the right reasons. And it's always good to see in F1, they're always looking for new ways to improve the spectacle of the sport and are prepared to make changes to the circuit layout in order to achieve that. Yeah, you're right. I've been very vocal about my first Grand Prix I ever saw. For those of you who don't know, that was the Canadian Grand Prix in 1995. And the reason why that memory sticks to me is it was a season dominated by Michael Schumacher. Me personally, looking back on his career, I think that was his best season in terms of his driving ability in the sport, although his better years did come later at Ferrari. But, for so many great reasons why that race was so enjoyable. But out of curiosity, Courtney, I think we've had this discussion before in the past, but what's the first race that you ever watched in F1? Because I know you come into the sport a bit later than I did.
Yeah, it was. So I watched bits of like races here and there, but I didn't really get into Formula One massively until you're going to hate me saying, until I found out Schumacher was retiring. Because around the time Schumacher was dominating so much, do you think, there's no point, Schumacher's always going to win? It's rich come from a Lewis Hamilton fan. I know. So I started watching on the tail end of 2006. So you sort of saw Fernando Alonso coming to the fore. And then I chose a good time to come in because you had Fernando Alonso against Lewis Hamilton, obviously, and then the Brits. That was easy for me as a Brit to follow. As a young Brit at the time, just to say, supporting another young Brit. And then obviously the season that went on there between him and Fernando got me absolutely hooked. And I still remember China. I still remember what happened in China as well. So
absolutely, yeah.
I got the highs and lows of being a fan of the sport very quickly, and that's what really got me into it.
Well, that's what it is. It's always something like that really gets you hooked on it. I always remember the Japanese Grand Prix in 1998 so vividly when Schumacher was battling Hakkinen, I should say, not Hamilton. Obviously, Hamilton would have been about, trying to think age-wise, it probably would have been about 13 years old, something like that. Anyway, but guys, let us know what your first race was watching Formula One, and let us know in the comments why you were so interested in getting into the sport. What was it about F1 that really brought you into the sport? It can be a race, can be a driver, could be a specific moment, whatever it is that you can think of. Do let us know. We'd love to find out and find out which one it was that made you interested in the sport that we all know and love. But on the topic of British drivers and all things that are great in British, not many of them, but still a lot of things to appreciate.
You had to. Anyway.
So, I was going to say it sooner rather than later. No, I'm a very patriotic person for all the good things about this country, although my opinions probably don't agree with many others. That being said, let's move on to something we can agree on, which is good news, and that is the British Grand Prix has announced formally that it's been given permission by the government to have full capacity for the race weekend. Now, of course, for those of you that are in the UK and wondering, oh, well, we're meant to be having our, if you like, Freedom Day, as it's being touted around on I think it's the 19th of July.
19th, yeah.
So the British Grand Prix is of the weekend, I think just before that. I think it's like one day before that. So it's around that ballpark time anyway. So I can imagine you'd agree that it's okay under the circumstances. If we're going to allow everything to open up, then the British Grand Prix just before that, I don't think people are going to mind too much. But it's a huge, huge story and a huge success story as well, because Stuart Pringle, the managing director at Silverstone, was obviously speaking to Sky Sports on this, and he said it's critically important that British fans and F1 fans alike are able to turn up to the British Grand Prix in the hundreds of thousands, which we expect to be, I think, over 140,000 over the course of just the race day as well. He was saying it's critical because they've relied so much on ticket revenue at the circuit for that weekend. You know, if we didn't have fans at this season's British Grand Prix, there's always the risk that Silverstone as a company could have gone bust. And that's a huge, when I first heard that, I was absolutely shocked. I didn't realize, I mean, obviously things were bad. I didn't realize it was as dire straits as that, Courtney. So, I mean, upon hearing this news, what are you excited to see that we're going to have loads of fans?
Yeah, it's amazing. Silverstone always provides a great atmosphere. You know, the cheers. You always have a load of fans bring the horns along as well. There's almost a carnival. It's a British style carnival, but it's a carnival nonetheless. Yeah, it's brilliant, and I don't know. I just think it'd be great for us, for obviously as fans, to see that after the awful sort of 18 months that we've had, for them to see that sort of that hopeful return to normality, celebration, and that sort of feeling that we get in the summer. You know, like the Silverstone is one of the things you look along with the Wimbledon final, sometimes football tournaments, and to get that sense of normality and having a full crowd cheering on, because they don't only support Lewis. You'll see a lot of Max Verstappen fans there as well. You'll see the Brits do get behind pretty much every driver. That British fans are, I'd say they're probably some of the least biased fans out there. They support whoever they are, regardless of which country they come from. So even if Max does win that race, there will still be a great atmosphere, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to look at British fans and think that we're all Lewis Hamilton fans. We're all partisans to the British drivers. And the reality is that we're not. If anything, we're one of the most split countries in terms of opinion on F1. I mean, for example, yeah, of course, I'm a huge fan of what Lewis Hamilton has done in the sport, and I'm a huge fan of his in general, but I'm not a Lewis Hamilton fan, or my preference would be to see a Ferrari on the podium. As much as I like to remain impartial on this podcast, I think everyone that's followed it for a while will know that my ideal F1 weekend would be the two red cars finishing first and second, and then everyone else can fight amongst themselves. It really doesn't make a difference to me. But, you know, there are so many different opinions. Like British fans, they love Williams, for example, McLaren, Red Bull, you know, even though the Verstappen Dutch domination going on at the moment at the team, it's very much a huge fan base that exists in Britain. So why a lot of the teams are based in Britain, not just for the fan base, but, you know, I don't want to come across as arrogant when I say this, or, you know, because F1 is a global sport and it belongs to the world, but there's something about it that when it comes to Silverstone, that it just feels like home. I know motorsport was invented in France. I'm perfectly aware of that, and it has a great, rich heritage there. But F1, it just feels like it comes home. Pardoning the pun, it just feels like it comes home when it comes to Silverstone. The first race, of course, ever in F1 at Silverstone back in the years, 70 odd years ago. And of course, for the first time, you'll have 140,000 British fans watching Sir Lewis Hamilton go down the Hamilton Straight for the first time, aptly named after him after his success last season. So that will certainly be a sight for Lewis Hamilton to go down a straight in this case, named after him at the start-finish line. So that would be pretty special. But it's going to be so great to have British fans and F1 fans back at the British Grand Prix. Of course, I would have loved to have gone. Unfortunately, I've got other commitments, I'm afraid. But certainly, Courtney, you and I are going to have to go down there and do a vlog video and chat to the fans and everything else, probably next season, hopefully, if things are much more back to normal around the world, not just in the UK as well. I think that's something some of our followers have been asking for, is for us to go to Silverstone and do some sort of vlog video or a DNF1 podcast live, if you like, at Silverstone.
Imagine that. You get all the drunks getting involved.
Oh, well, I'm counting on it.
We'll be a couple of the drunks.
Well, I mean, we're going to have to be, considering some of the people probably bump into. I mean, do you remember? I remember watching the F1 show a few years ago, and Crofty and Simon Lazenby were going through the the fan parks, obviously where people camp out, because at Silverstone, obviously they've got huge fields, like 500 acres, I think the entire structure is. And there's a huge fan park, of course, where a load of fans camp out, stay out. It's kind of like Glastonbury for F1, if you like, the equivalent of. And they were looking for some Dutch fans that were Max Verstappen fans. And Crofty wanted to find someone with a Max Verstappen tattoo as part of a task here to do. And there was this guy sitting in a pool with all his friends all drinking, and literally pulled his shorts down to expose his bare ass in front of Crofty, and it had Max Verstappen tattoo on his ass. Of course, it was pixelated so we couldn't see it. I'm glad we didn't, but yeah, the passion of some of these F1 fans is beyond. I don't know who can convince themselves to get a tattoo of a Formula One driver on their bare ass like that. I mean, for the rest of their lives.
It must be down to a bet. Must have been.
Well, I hope so, and probably lost a bet as well to get one done there in particular. But who knows? I'm not sure if Max is aware of it. I mean, there's a lot of things Max's fans have made over the past, a few songs in particular that he's only been made aware of recently. We won't be playing that on here because we don't want this episode to be copyrighted or anything like that. But if you do know the Pit Stop boys that make Supermax and they want to get in touch, do let us know. I'd love to have them on. Anyway, let's get into the other little news talking about it. Something I did want to talk about briefly. And according to an article that I saw on Race Fans, trying to find it on here. Yeah, racefans.net, for those of you that don't know. They've mentioned an article about the FIA trying to force F1 teams to slow down their pit stops. Now, the long story short is that apparently the FIA have been a bit concerned that F1 teams are trying to go too fast at completing their pit stops. And as a result, is increasing the risk or the chance that the tyres aren't being fitted onto the cars properly. And of course, cause issues where the tyres fall off, and then it creates a health and safety issue. Now, the problem is that I read through this article and it talks a lot about Red Bull in particular as one of the, well, not one of the reasons for why they're considering this, but Red Bull have been the fastest team at 5 of the 7 races this season with their pit stop, the fastest of which being the 2.04 seconds that Sergio Perez's stop was at the French Grand Prix. And it was about 0.2 of a second faster than everyone else. Now, they want to introduce sensors so that they can make sure that what the mechanics are doing when they make these changes is that they're doing them as a reaction, not out of anticipation when they expect to be doing a certain part of the process. In other words, not guessing. They want to make sure that they've got the tyre in hand to put the tyre on. They don't want to just do it at a point where they expect it to be. And, you know, for the life of me, when they keep mentioning Red Bull, and a few of the other teams have as well, as I said, I don't know what it is. It's just quoted from the article. So I won't quote which teams that they could possibly be. It could be anybody. But I find it really strange when Red Bull is being used in this case to sort of argue a point, because Courtney, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't remember the last time that Red Bull did a pit stop and then their car had to pull over or retire because the wheel was about to fall off it had fallen off and they had to pull over. I think the last time I saw Red Bull make a serious mistake with a pit stop relating to this sort of thing was back in Monaco 2016, where they forgot to bring the tyres out to put on Daniel Ricciardo's car, which cost him the race that weekend. So I don't know why they're using Red Bull in this argument.
I think it's probably clear that some of Red Bull's rivals are going to attempt, because at the end of the day, we get this in Formula One all the time. And if anything, Red Bull have been sort of the biggest moaners about other teams in recent years. But it would surprise me if certain teams that are, shall we say, competing with Red Bull are trying their luck to see if they can sort of slow down Red Bull in, obviously, which is one less straps, because with this tight championship, the pit stops could be crucial. So at the same time, one of the biggest issues I have with Formula One as a fan is the fact that whenever a team finds a way to be exceptional, so I think whether it be with pit stops or whether it be with innovations, so like with the DAS system last season, for example, they overrule it. And at the end of the day, this is supposed to be a sport where you innovate in order to be the best. And if you don't like being beaten, you find a way to catch up, and if not, beat them yourselves. That should be the whole point in this sport. And we just keep on getting robbed of these of skill, great innovation, just for the sake of making other people happy. And it's just something that winds me up about Formula One a bit.
Yeah, it's always been a huge problem in this sport where, we're surrounded by some of the most brilliantly intelligent men and women in the entire world. And yet they come up with some of these great ideas, which are almost groundbreaking to a degree. And yet more often than not, if other teams can't keep up with that for whatever reason, rather than hold your hands up and say, well done, guys, it's fantastic, they tend to spend a lot of effort just getting it outlawed. And more often than not, that does happen. DAS is a great example, that the teams thought feasibility wise, they could prepare one and make one. It would take about 6 months and a lot of money. But they realized because of rule changes that were going to happen, there's just no value in it. So they just decided to get rid of it altogether. And, the FIA decided to agree with that, which is disappointing. And perhaps this season it has created a scenario why Mercedes are not as dominant as they were last season. Perhaps that is one of the big mitigating factors. We won't know, but, there you go. But in this case, I find it ridiculous that they're thinking of introducing something like this. We always... something that we've marveled over the last couple of years in particular is how quick pit stops have been since they banned refueling and it's only tyre changes. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm always curious to know how quick a pit stop is. And it always plays into, will they undercut this person or will they overcut them? It's all that you're trying to figure out in your head what's going on. And then you see Red Bull rock up with like a 1.8 second pit stop that they did at Brazil last season. It was just madness. It's incredible speed to take 4 tires off a car, put 4 tires on, and he's so quick. So for me, I don't buy what they're trying to achieve with this. I really don't. I feel like it's going to take an element out of the game that we actually enjoy, and it's just going to make it boring just for the sake of trying to level the playing field. I'm sorry. It's kind of like the old gamer thing where you try and taunt other people that aren't as good as you and just say, well, get good. Sorry.
Exactly. Spot on.
But of course, if this is going to go ahead, guys, I should stress this is from an article that we've seen that a few people have looked at and talked about. They are planning to potentially introduce this in August around the Hungarian Grand Prix. So we won't see it yet. But as I said, if it does go ahead, we'll probably hear more about it soon and more people will probably be talking about it. So I'll leave that to you guys amongst yourselves to talk about for the time being. We'll just have to watch this space and see what happens. Now, of course, getting into the main talking point of the podcast today, we are going to be talking about the Styrian Grand Prix preview. So without further ado, Courtney, let's get right into it. Styrian Grand Prix this weekend, Max Verstappen leads the Drivers' Championship by 12 points. So, of course, assuming Max, if he does finish behind Lewis Hamilton this weekend, will still lead the World Championship. And whilst he doesn't have a massive buffer, say 25 points plus over Lewis Hamilton, there's probably a lot of confidence that Max will take going into this race from having somewhat of a gap between himself and Lewis to a point where he feels that Lewis won't overtake him after one race.
I think the change that we've probably seen highlighted in France is the fact that Red Bull have the confidence when it comes to strategy. Now, that was the thing that Mercedes had going for them the most. When you have a look at Spain in particular, when the teams were close, Mercedes had the strategic advantage. Didn't quite go to plan for Mercedes. They had a poor weekend in terms of strategy. If you look at Bottas was trying to warn them that this is a 2-stop strategy, and he wasn't listened to, hence the reaction that he got. And it just seems Mercedes just don't seem to be themselves. They seem a little bit rattled by the challenge from Red Bull. Can they turn it around? I think they can. But going into this weekend, I'm quite intrigued about the weekend itself because, in theory, Mercedes should be strong, plenty of high-speed corners. But actually, traditionally, Red Bull would tend to have been stronger in Austria. And Verstappen's had some great races, as we know in at this circuit. So I'm expecting another close weekend. But let's not forget there is rain forecast. So all these predictions could mean absolutely nothing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, I was going to talk on the subject of the weather as well. But since you mentioned it, I might as well. That is one thing I think that Mercedes will look forward to if it actually does come to fruition. Now, of course, Red Bull in the wet weather has proved to be pretty good as well. But let's not forget, this time last year, the last time we went to the Styrian Grand Prix and it rained and the way it did in qualifying, a certain Lewis Hamilton ended up producing one of the greatest qualifying laps of all time. I think you'd all agree, by being 1.2 seconds faster than everybody else. Now, yes, usual caveats aside, Mercedes had a much more competitive car, at least more dominant car compared to the rest of the field than they do this season. But even still, 1.2 seconds is absolutely huge. That is the difference between you're in F1 versus you shouldn't be in this sport. That kind of margin, let alone first place to everybody else. So, if it does rain in Austria this weekend, I think a lot of us will be expecting Lewis to really be on top of his game. And I think one thing that should be said in all of this, that despite Red Bull being so mighty and so dominant at the moment, with the exception for Monaco, I don't think you can really ask much more of Lewis Hamilton in the level that he's performing. I think he's performing to an incredibly high standard. It's just at the moment, perhaps for the first time in the last 7 or 8 years, he's up against the competition from another team and another driver that just have them beat all ends up in almost every way, at least what counts at the moment. That being said, there's still plenty of time to go in this championship, despite the fact that Red Bull will probably feel quite confident that they could probably beat Mercedes at almost any circuit, especially after what happened last weekend's French Grand Prix.
Yeah, Red Bull do have the advantage, but it's not a massive one. And look, this is what the fans have been hoping for, a close battle. I do expect to see a few driving masterclasses from Lewis. I think we could hopefully, fingers crossed, obviously from my perspective, we do get that this weekend, particularly if it rains. But I think, yeah, we've had this whole debate over, Lewis, is it because of the car? Is it because of the driver? And actually, I think this season's proving that Lewis does actually have it, despite the car. He's been let down once or twice this season by strategy. Let's not forget that Lewis could have easily have won the French Grand Prix. It's just things went wrong at the very end. So I think it's way too early to call out Lewis in his championship. I do think Red Bull will win the Constructors' Championship, but I still think Lewis does have a good chance still winning the Drivers' Championship.
Absolutely. And of course, when Lewis has made the rare and odd mistake this season, 9 times out of 10, he's recovered from it and been able to salvage a big haul of points, if not still win the race. So, there's still a long way to go in this championship. I do feel that Mercedes do have to respond this weekend. I know it sounds like a bit of a repeating pattern now, which is unorthodox in this era. We've never really had that before, but it is something Mercedes need to address. I think we've always been used to this idea that Mercedes will be very respondent and be very defiant in the race that follows and say, yes, we will get this right. Our rivals fear us when we lose because that is when we learn the most lessons and, produce at the next Grand Prix. But of course, that hasn't happened in the last few races. So we really do need to hope that Mercedes, for the sake of the championship, can really get their act together, because right now, 2 races in a row on Red Bull's home turf, as you mentioned, Courtney, Red Bull have been very good despite not having a good car. Now that they do, all signs do point at the moment towards another win for Red Bull and Max Verstappen. But of course, if we all knew that, we wouldn't be interested in this sport. And if there's anyone that can overturn this, it's Lewis Hamilton in particular. But moving away from the front 2 drivers in this championship battle, I think you and I can agree, Courtney, that those 2 are going to be the favourites to fight for this weekend's Grand Prix. I don't expect that to be any different. Do you feel that there could be an outside influence from the other side of the garage in Perez and Valtteri Bottas? Do you feel that Perez this weekend could be, again, just as useful, just as resourceful as he has been in Baku and in France? And if so, how do you think that's going to go down for him? Do you think he's going to be a factor to win the race, or do you feel he's going to be once again trying to be the supporting rear gunner for Max Verstappen?
Well, the likelihood is he will be the supporting driver, but I think we are going to be seeing a weekend soon where Perez could be a threat to Max. We actually saw it back. I think people forget that, yes, Perez won because Verstappen went out, but Perez was sublime in Baku, and there were times where he's actually faster than Max. So there will be a race or 2 this season where I do expect Perez to be the faster driver, particularly on the Saturday. So I think, look, we've had this Perez Bottas. We've discussed this so much, but it's an important thing that doesn't get discussed enough. Perez will probably play a bigger role in sort of, holding Lewis back. Bottas has improved. Let's not forget Bottas did improve in France, but I still feel there are tensions behind the scenes just sort of holding him back a little bit. And I think there needs to be a solution to that in order to Mercedes to be more competitive in his championship.
No, absolutely. I think the one thing that worries me about Perez at this weekend's Grand Prix is, given that Austria is so traditionally short, I mean, there are 10 corners on the map, but let's be honest, there's probably 8 in truth. Turn 2 doesn't exist. And then further down, you've got, I think it's turn 8. To be honest, yeah, it's a right-hander, but if you get turn 7 right, turn 8 is practically straight as well. But that being said, it's a short lap. So if Perez doesn't hook it up in qualifying, as that's been an area that he has struggled at most places this season compared to Max Verstappen, he may find himself in a position where he's not fighting Max, Lewis, and Valtteri in qualifying. He may come under pressure from the Ferraris and the McLarens behind him, and even Pierre Gasly in the AlphaTauri, which of course that has been a factor this season. So, qualifying is going to be critical for Perez. I have absolute confidence that he can do the job he needs to do there, but it will make his life a lot easier if he can avoid getting bogged down behind those guys behind him, as he did in France, because of course we saw that when he's ahead of the competition behind and he can do his job for his team, that's when he excels. And he did the same thing at Baku as well, to a degree. So, so hopefully for his sake that he's able to repeat that. We'll see how he gets on. Valtteri Bottas, as you pointed out, Courtney, huge weekend for him. A lot of ambiguity still existing at the moment over will he stay? Will he be let go by Mercedes? And it does seem that is playing a huge amount on his mind at the moment. It definitely is affecting him. I think anybody can see that not everything is okay in the Bottas camp at the moment, especially in this sort of not necessarily traditional feud, but whatever is going on between him and his team at the moment is far from harmonious. And that is not something that a driver like Bottas needs. I mean, there are only a few drivers on this grid that can sort of carry on performing to a higher standard, regardless of the environment that they find themselves in their team. Valtteri is certainly not one of them. I read an interesting article, I think it was motorsport.com, that had an interview with one Pablo Montoya, the former Williams and McLaren driver. And he actually mentioned that, whilst we don't know if Valtteri Bottas is going to be at Mercedes next season or it's going to be George Russell, rather than wait to the end of the season, which Toto Wolff jokingly was alluding to doing, it might be better just to get it out in the open, or at the very least, tell Valtteri now, if you haven't already, whether he's going to be at the team next season or not, because by delaying that decision, you've got that extra thought process, that extra energy that mentally he's going to be focusing on rather than concentrating on the job at hand. And perhaps if you actually just gave him that closure now, rather than making him wait for it or worry about it, Valtteri can just get his head down and do the job that he's meant to do for Mercedes. And I think you would agree, Courtney, it's got similar hallmarks to Ferrari and Raikkonen in 2018. And I think like Kimi did eventually after what happened in Italy, the rest of the season that followed, Valtteri, you'd expect him to do a professional job and do the job he needs to, and will probably do a better job ultimately at Mercedes, with the team obviously in return paying him back the same amount of quality and respect to actually do the best they can to help not only Mercedes in this Constructors' Championship, but support Lewis in trying to win the Drivers' Championship with Max. Because right now, Lewis is fighting 2 Red Bulls on his own, and there just doesn't seem to be a cohesion between Bottas and Mercedes to do their bit to help him as well.
Well, yeah, the circumstances of the championship isn't helping the situation at all. If this had happened last season when Mercedes weren't completely dominant, then it wouldn't have been damaging to obviously not only the team but the drivers. But this championship is so close, and if anything, Red Bull are edging it. You can't be if you're in a close battle or you're struggling compared to your usual level, you can't afford to have other things making the situation worse. Everything else needs to be on point in order for you to be competitive. So I do believe that this situation is actually hindering Mercedes a lot more than people might believe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I completely agree to that. So we'll just have to wait and see how that works out. But let's move on to the best of the rest battle at the moment between McLaren and Ferrari. Now, it's a bit of an eye-opener weekend we had for Ferrari at the French Grand Prix after a very successful Baku Grand Prix, relatively speaking, and also an incredibly successful Monaco Grand Prix to a degree, but could have even been even more successful. Ferrari found themselves in a situation that they probably anticipated to a degree, but I don't think anybody expected them to struggle as much as they did during the race, especially with the tyre degradation they experienced much more severely than others. And I think it kind of exposed certain hallmarks of the car that have been almost gone under the radar, given how impressive they have been in almost every other area that's relevant. And this particular area should not be understated because, of course, if your car's not able to hold on to its tyres or at least the level of grip for longer than 5 laps, you're going to struggle in a race. Ferrari know better than anyone. You don't win points in F1 on a Saturday. If they did, they'd be certainly doing very well in the championship. But, the big problem at Ferrari at the moment compared to McLaren is that race pace on the Sunday, where the McLaren seems to be very, very mighty. And I suppose going into this race, Ferrari are probably hoping for better fortunes, a good qualifying performance they'd expect to have, and they probably would expect to do well here as well. But do you think that's going to be the case, Courtney, or do you think that they may experience more of a hangover following what we saw in France than compared to what McLaren are expecting?
I think the thing that is telling with Ferrari this season is that probably they don't even know if they're going to be strong or struggling. And the thing I've noticed with this Ferrari McLaren battle is that McLaren, particularly on a Sunday, seem to be strong wherever they go. Whereas Ferrari seem to be very dependent on the track specifics every Grand Prix. And I think Ferrari have already admitted they're already thinking about next season. So in my mind, with the respective performances of the cars we're seeing so far, I think it's certainly advantage McLaren, particularly with Daniel Ricciardo improving. Nothing against the two drivers that Ferrari have. I think that their driver pairing is actually it's fantastic. They would do great things in the championship battle. But the way the development with the two respective cars we're seeing right now, I think the advantage is certainly McLaren's.
It certainly looks that way, considering that we just had a few races where it seemed the pendulum was swinging the other way, massively in favour of Ferrari. It's now seemed to have swung back quite emphatically to McLaren. And it does raise that question over how often are we going to see a performance like that from Ferrari this season? We saw something similar in Portimao where they struggled and fell down the order. And we've seen at most races, if you think about it, that Ferrari have been mighty in qualifying, but they've tended to fall down the order. I think I was looking at the stats and performances of the cars in qualifying compared to the race, and I think the lead Ferrari on average is qualifying around 3.4 in terms of position out of 20, and McLaren is around about in the sixes, which is quite a difference, about 3 places or 2 places, if you like, on average. But in the race, the Ferrari on average loses 2 places and the lead McLaren gains 2 places. So they're pretty much neck and neck. But I'll be honest with you, you're much more comfortable in a better race car. And given how well that Lando Norris has been, being the lead McLaren, beating the lead Ferrari, which has mostly been Charles Leclerc, at 4 out of the 7 races this season, it does seem now that Daniel was getting his act together in McLaren as he did last weekend, that this is going to get even harder for Ferrari to overcome. And we may find that unless Ferrari find a short-term significant solution to their issues with tyre degradation, that it could undermine all of the good things about the car, because the car is very, very good. And I still maintain that it's the 3rd best car on the grid when you talk about sheer pace. But unfortunately, because of the other factors that come into play, such as tyre deg and longevity and consistency, and of course how effective it is in a variable number of operating windows, the McLaren does seem to have it beat in more areas than not. So it's a huge mountain to climb.
Yeah, what I'd like to say, another thing is, are Ferrari either going to put a lot of effort into finding solutions to this problem? Because let's go back a couple of seasons. They made it very clear the emphasis is going to be short-term pain, long-term gain in order to get back on top. And I think next season's going to be a big goal of theirs. Hence, what I do believe that they're not really going to be putting too much emphasis on this season's car in order to be better next season. I think Ferrari and McLaren, 2 teams that really need to be watched next season. And that's for that reason, and the promises that are being made to the Ferrari fans, I don't think they're going to put too much effort into this year's car anymore.
No, I agree. And from what I've heard from the Ferrari camp and McLaren as well, to a degree, that they are introducing a few more new parts. There's going to be part of not a major upgrade, but it's just stuff that's already been in the works for a while now, and it's going to be probably the final round of upgrades we're going to see from both teams. In Ferrari's case, it's going to make the car faster. We saw them experiment with a new front wing at France, which of course wasn't related to the downturn in performance, if you like, of the car during the race. If anything, it was a positive. But there will be a few more bits going on that car before the season is up. But as I said, it's going to happen probably all before the summer break. And I think after that, 100% focus is going to go onto the new car, as I expect the same with a lot of teams already, McLaren as well, because of course the ATR rule changes are going to change based on the Constructors' Championship. So obviously that's going to mean a lot to the teams that are higher up, need to allocate more of the time they have available because there'll be less of it to use, whereas the lower teams, of course, will have more room. But they're all going to be in the same boat by that point. I'd be surprised if anybody's bringing any significant upgrades after the summer break. And if they are, they shouldn't be, unless they're fighting for a world championship. But that being said, I mean, we talked about Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. I don't really think there's too much that we can say on them. I think they did the best jobs that they could to a degree. Leclerc had a pretty bad race by his own admission in France, and I can agree with that. I think he just got it completely wrong, whereas Sainz tried, but ultimately just wasn't good enough. But on the subject of Daniel Ricciardo, and of course, he had a very, very good drive in France. Easily the best weekend I think he's had this season. How do you see him getting on this weekend, Courtney? Because this is a circuit that he's had fond memories of. I think he was the winner here last time Red Bull won at the Austrian Grand Prix, I think back in 2017. So how do you see this weekend going for him? Do you feel that he's going to go up a bit, he's going to be a bit better than he was in France, maybe challenge Lando Norris this weekend? Or do you feel that it's still part of the learning process and perhaps we shouldn't get too carried away in terms of Daniel's progress in this car, because it's not an easy car to get on top of?
Exactly. I wouldn't be surprised if he was to struggle in comparison to last week, given that it is a slow process. I expect him to be a solid driver again, though, because he's always a kind of driver that his team could rely on. I'm expecting him to be a solid driver at least, but I'm not expecting him to be challenging Lando. But if he was, it wouldn't be the biggest surprise in the world. But I think he's focusing on being a solid driver for the team, and then in the coming races, he'll probably be aiming to challenge Lando Norris.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know a friend of mine is hoping that Daniel will continue to progress and do well. I'm sure she'll be very interested in keeping on his progress, probably a bit too interested if you ask me, but that's, we've all got our favorites. Let's move on to the next cohort of teams, if you like, the next cluster, the Aston Martins, Alpines, and the AlphaTauris this weekend. Going on to Alpine, Fernando Alonso, we were very surprised and delighted to see that he makes such significant progress at the French Grand Prix. He was very much in the fight, and you would argue that if the Alpine had a bit more grunt to it, could have been more of a threat to the McLarens than he actually was. But how do you expect this weekend to go to Fernando? Because he's been here a lot, obviously very successful here in his Renault days. And given that this lap is such a short lap, this could be a weekend where Fernando could challenge to be one of the best guys in the midfield this weekend, as he was in France.
Well, the name alone, he's definitely capable of doing it. The car has improved. I think he's another driver that's getting a lot more comfortable with the car. He's got the experience in order to get it where it needs to be. It's just going to be very, very tight. I still think Pierre Gasly is the star of that cluster of drivers. I think he's been exceptional. But Fernando Alonso, we know how good that guy is on his day. If anyone can do it, it's him. But I do expect that battle around there to be very tight.
Yeah, I mean, it could be one of those weekends where, so much could happen from any one of those three teams. I mean, Aston Martin certainly can't be discounted. And at a circuit like here, this could be a weekend where they may actually fancy themselves a bit more with less corners to worry about. And of those are there, the high-speed corners might suit their car a bit better. So they seem to be quietly going about their business and getting better week in, week out. So, especially Sebastian Vettel, the way that he's been driving, I think he's going to be a big factor once again. He does like it around this circuit. So there's certainly a lot of optimism around the Aston Martin team at the moment. Esteban Ocon definitely needs to return to form. Just thinking of recent memory on his results around it, it's not exactly been the happiest of hunting grounds for him. But he's certainly more than good enough to make that right. As I said, there's a good case for a lot of guys around this circuit. He's certainly one of them. How do you think he'll respond this weekend, Courtney? Not just to the disappointment at his home race, but also the sudden rise of his teammate and the rise of the competition in Aston Martin in particular. I
reckon he had a little bit of a hangover after partying because he got his new contract. I reckon that's what it was. His form overall this season has been much better. Better than most of us expected, to be fair to the guy. Again, he can turn it around, but I think the likes of Alonso and Gasly are going to be too good for him. So I think this would be the type of weekend where he just needs a solid weekend. Don't get yourself into any trouble, and it's because he has to form, so he can do it. But I expect the likes of Fernando Alonso and Pierre Gasly to have the advantage over him.
Mm. And let's not forget Lance Stroll as well. You know, Stroll's been very good round here. Last season, he was going very well in the Racing Point until he had mechanical issues in the Racing Point, which let him down. Of course, he was very much involved with that battle with Lando Norris at the Austrian Grand Prix. And of course, Sergio Perez, when he was in the Racing Point, if we had that damage that literally went all the way. Hopefully for Lance, he won't be trying to be as bold with his overtaking into turn 3 as he was when he was a bit overzealous, I think is the right way of putting it, against Lando. Perhaps he'd be a bit more calmer, but he's certainly a track Lance does enjoy. So hopefully he goes well here. Pierre Gasly, I don't think there's much more we need to say about Pierre Gasly we haven't already done. I think one thing I will ask Courtney is, given how good Gasly is driving in that AlphaTauri at the moment, could you see him potentially challenging McLaren and Ferrari for best of the rest overall? Because he seems to be another driver who qualifies very well, but the performance of that car just doesn't allow him to sustain that on the Sunday.
Oh yeah, as I said, he's been sublime this season. Really, really impressive. Following on from last season, we had his moments, and let's not forget this rain. The rain is going to play a part, and Pierre Gasly has been a specialist in getting great results in chaotic races. So I think Pierre Gasly might be one of the guys to keep an eye on this weekend.
Let's hope so. Yeah, the wet weather is certainly going to be a factor as well. We should not ignore that. Yuki Tsunoda, it seems to be one step forward with him and 2 steps back, although we should give him credit where credit's due, being a rookie, and he has got the performance. I think we're both big fans of Yuki, and it's going to be an interesting weekend to see how he gets on, because this is certainly a circuit that you can't really afford to make mistakes, because you don't really have much time or much opportunity around the rest of the circuit to make up for that if you lose time around here. So how do you see Yuki getting on this weekend, Courtney? Do you think he can get himself back up amongst the points as he did in Baku, or do you feel that this is a circuit that requires him to be faultless, and rarely this season he hasn't really been that way?
I think Yuki Tsunoda is one of the drivers that's under a lot of pressure at the moment. 2 reasons. First of all, obviously his teammates doing so well, and obviously for any driver, if your teammate's doing a lot better than you, it doesn't look good. And also, he had such an interesting start to his Formula One career that there was a lot of hype surrounding him. So, in a strange way, the hype is kind of putting pressure on him because the fan base expects more from him. He's just going through. It's been a few races now. We have struggled a bit, and he just needs to get himself back on track, no pun intended, and get himself up there, because you've seen what Pierre Gasly's able to do. So he can't be blaming the car for it, because the car's pretty solid this season.
It is a very all-round good car. Perhaps not as good as we thought it was going to be, but in certainly Pierre's hands, it's a very quick car in his hands. And Yuki, on occasion, has been able to, exert that kind of performance, but it's just not been consistent enough. So hopefully for Yuki, if he can cut out the small errors, and they're only small errors, but unfortunately in Formula One, you do pay a big price regardless of your error, whether they be small or big. Hopefully he can just put together a error-free weekend and see how that goes for him. Maybe he will get some points. A team that could challenge for points at any circuit this season, we'd have to wait and see how that transpires. Alfa Romeo, there's not a lot to say on Alfa Romeo. They're the team that's probably been given the least coverage of anybody this season for one reason or another, despite the fact it's one of the best looking cars on the grid. I'm just going to ask you the question on them, Courtney. Do you see Alfa Romeo potentially getting a point this weekend, or do you feel that they just don't have the speed in this car to challenge the likes of Aston Martin, Alpine, Alfa, McLaren, and Ferrari?
On the dry weekend, I'd say no, but that might not be the case. I think if it rains, I think there are 1 or 2 drivers out there. I'm fingers crossed for another one we're about to mention. This could be an opportunity for some of the drivers to make a name for themselves.
One way or another, one thing I've enjoyed watching about Alfa Romeo this season, both of their drivers, is that they've been very, very good at picking up the pieces where others have made mistakes. I'm thinking Monaco and Imola in particular, some crazy moments we had in those races, and they were there or thereabouts. Even in Baku, they very nearly got into the points despite everything that was going on. So, if something does happen in this race and it's all a bit mad and something exciting happens, don't be surprised to see them in that battle. They do end up there more often than not. So I think they're doing a good job, both of those guys. I think ultimately that car just isn't anywhere near good enough, unfortunately. It's in its own sort of little league. It's not good enough to be in the midfield. but it's certainly a lot better than the two teams behind it. They always seem to light up the timing sheets on Friday, but I think everyone knows now that Alfa Romeo tend to run lighter than anybody else and tend to turn up the Ferrari engine a bit more. Go for the headline times if you like, but it's certainly not. It doesn't transpire into the performance on a Sunday, unfortunately for them. So Williams, George Russell, Nicholas Latifi, we always tease this idea that George Russell could potentially get points. And I don't think we're going to change our stance on this one. There's always a chance. But after a very, very good performance in France, where he put together arguably his best performance at Williams, finishing in 12th, if he can perform like that again this weekend, do you feel that George could potentially fancy getting a point at long last? Do you think that is doable at this track? Maybe more so than the others?
Yeah, it's you can tell by my body language. I'm stressed for him because he's capable of doing it. It's the gods have always seemed to go against him. You know, it's such a shame because I do think he's a great driver, but with the rain, he just needs a clean race. When it's raining, easier said than done for obvious reasons. Have a clean race, George, and I reckon he can do it. I really do think he can do it because I reckon with some of the battles we're already seeing, throw rain into the mix, I think we could be seeing a few drivers going off.
Maybe he might get a bit more luck around this circuit because everyone was bulletproof at the French Grand Prix. So much runoff area all over the track. They won't get that luxury here in Austria. So I'd be very surprised if everybody finished the race. I mean, last year's Styrian Grand Prix, we lost both Ferraris at turn 3 when Charles Leclerc ended up driving into the back of Sebastian Vettel's Ferrari, being a bit overzealous with his overtaking. So, of course, you never, ever know. It could go George's way. And at a track like Austria, Courtney, because it's so short and the way that it's designed, there's less room, when things do go wrong, of course, it's so hard to make it back. But there is less for the car to go wrong at. And the Williams car this season, we've talked about peaky downforce more than I care to admit. But at the same time, there's less areas of that track for that car to be exposed in the slow corners. So it could be a track more than others that Williams might find the deficit of performance compared to the others isn't so great as it has been.
Fingers crossed, because the guy's been overdue this point for Williams for a very long time, and the performance that he put in France should be very encouraging for him.
Yeah, let's hope for the best day. But then Latifi, of course, Latifi in the races, he seems to be quite quiet and he finishes. I mean, he's obviously not as quick as George, but he does do a decent job in the race as best as he can. It's hard to gauge where his level actually is at the moment. Until that car's better, I don't think we're going to know, although he certainly will have the time, a drive of his back in, and I think he's good enough to be in the sport, but there's always that risk that there are going to be other drivers in junior categories gunning for his seat, the likes of Jack Aitken, Dan Ticktum, both in the Williams Academy, looking at that seat potentially for the future. We'll just have to wait and see. Maybe next season, we'll have to see how it goes for them in the F2 Championship, particularly Dan Ticktum, who's doing quite a good job at the moment. Let's talk about Haas to round this all off. Are we expecting any miracles from this team? Because it seems like Mick Schumacher gave them their highlight moment, finishing 13th in Azerbaijan, and then miraculously it goes away for them as George Russell counters with the 12th for Williams at the very next race. Is there any chance that Haas could respond and get 11th, or dare I say even a championship point?
I had a thought, right? Could you imagine if it rains, we have a Kartik race and Nikita Mazepin gets his first point for Haas before George Russell gets his for Williams? I think the F1 fan base should have a meltdown.
I mean, we should always give credit where credit is due. And I suppose if Nikita Mazepin does somehow manage to get a point in Formula One, we will have to praise it under the circumstances. I mean, I'm just trying to imagine how that would happen, let alone what the reaction would be. It would certainly be an interesting race. Whatever happens, if Nikita does get a point, how that would happen, I don't know. But you know what? I'd have to, bring whatever race on that he does, because it's certainly going to be a fun one to watch. And then you see him in there, and then some people will be like, can we go back to
There'll be meltdowns left, right, and centre.
Yeah. I mean, look, let's not excuse what he did and his attitude towards the whole thing. It was disgusting behaviour, and until such a time is where he's actually remorseful for his actions and learns for them and becomes a better person, whenever that may be. Not that I know him personally. it would just, you have to review it then. But, you got to review things as they are now as a driver. He's in Formula One. He's doing what he's doing as a driver, and you have to judge him on that. He is improving as a driver. The battle is always going to be against Mick Schumacher at the moment, but we'll just have to wait and see. Who knows? On the subject of Mick, though, as I said last week, I think Mick needs to try and find ways to sort of calm things down and try and cut out the crashes, because he does seem to be making quite a lot of them. And I think because it's Mick Schumacher, it's gone under the radar a little bit. If it was Mazepin, we'd be talking about it as like we'd dedicate a whole episode to a collage of crashes from Nikita Mazepin. But for Mick Schumacher, obviously, it's another weekend where he's had fond memories here. He's won a few races in F3 at Austria. He won the Formula 3 Championship. Well, Formula 3, it was GP3 Europe Championship at the time. And he's had good performances here in F2 as well. So this is going to be a circuit that I think Mick will want to do well at. Interestingly enough, Courtney, this time last year, Mick, when he was in the F2 race, was running, I think it was second at the time. And the fire extinguisher went off inside his Prema, which is an automatic disqualification. If you finish without one, you have to retire. So I'm sure Mick will be hoping for much better luck this weekend than that one. Interestingly enough, he did. There was a video going around the internet of him with Sebastian Vettel looking at his seat inside the Haas, and he was asking him some questions. Turned out that was because he sits a bit crooked to how he would like to in the car. And this is something he's had a long time. It's not just a new thing. He's had it since the junior Formula categories. And he was just asking Seb for some advice about how to get it fixed in his seat, because you can't just turn up with a brand new seat. You need to get it fitted and made up and everything. Seb just said, just break the seat and they'll bring you a new one. But I don't think that's going to be...
Maybe that's what he's trying to do. Maybe that's what he's trying to do in those crashes.
Maybe. I mean, I wouldn't advise it at all. But yeah, it's just a really interesting story. Apparently, Mick says it has nothing to do with how his mistakes or the performances. But I'm just hoping this weekend Mick stays error-free. You don't see him spinning around in practice or having a crash in qualifying, because a Q2 appearance is a Q2 appearance, but you want to see tangible signs of progress, not ones we say, oh yeah, he got into Q2, but he did cause a red flag, so, take one way or the other. But we'll have to wait and see what you can do. This crazy weekend it could be, maybe, who knows. Before we wrap this up, Courtney, let's round this off as we always do. Let's go with our predictions for this one.
Can we do a wet and dry scenario?
Okay.
We're going to go this dry.
No.
Dry.
Yeah.
So in dry, so we're answering who's going to finish in the top 3 in dry conditions, yeah?
I think let's just go to the top 3 anyway. Let's not worry about whether it's going to rain, because we've seen before it rains at race, or say it's going to rain and then it's bone dry the whole weekend. Or if it does rain, it doesn't come till after the race. So this just regular top 3.
Okay, I'm going to be a bore and go with the traditional 3 that I'll go with, which is in there or thereabouts. Verstappen first, Lewis second, Perez third.
I mean, I've built up a reputation on this show as being the jinx for whichever driver I decide to pick to win. And again, it was proven last weekend. I tried to play it smart and tried to give Lewis the benefit of the doubt, and then he ended up losing the race. So against what I predicted, I really thought Lewis was going to win last week. So imagine my shock when 2 laps before the end that Verstappen took the win from him. But no, I think given the form of the team and his own personal form at the moment and how good they usually are around the circuit, as much as I'd like to say I think Mercedes and Hamilton will win, I'm going to go with Max this weekend. I just think that right now he is the man to beat and everything is going well for him. And I just see that continuing. I think it's going to be a close race. I think Lewis is going to fight him all the way, but I think he's going to come up short just about. So I have to wait and see if that one comes true. My odds are not favourable on that. And third place, I'm going to go with Lando Norris. I think this is a track that could bridge the gap between those top teams and the midfield teams to a degree. And Lando got a podium here last season in the Austrian race, and he drove very well in the Styrian race. So same venue, I'm expecting Scenario 7 to make an appearance once again. And yeah, Lando to get a podium once again.
What are you complaining about that?
No, absolutely not. Who are we predicting for pole position?
Oh, it's going to be Max. The Red Bull seems to have a particular advantage on a Saturday.
I'm going to go with Lewis for pole. I just think he loves it around here. He loves a good pole position around here. And as I said, if it rains, you can't ignore that time he did last season at the same race. And, you know, despite the changes in performance to the cars and the drivers, that is still a huge goal to overturn. We'll have to wait and see. What's your bold prediction for this weekend? You know, something crazy that could happen in this race, or perhaps someone finishing in the points that doesn't normally finish there.
Well, obviously, I'd like to say George Russell in the points. I think Pierre Gasly. I feel that Pierre Gasly could do something special this weekend.
Okay. I'm going to be boring. I'm going to go with George Russell to get a point. I just think, you know, it could be his time. I say this a lot of weekends. It's bound to come true at some point.
Every weekend we say it.
It's bound to come true at some point. Honestly, like there's some really... I was on a podcast the other day. Tom Horrocks, who was on our show the other week, does the Monkey Seat podcast. On it, he had this this wheel, like the Wheel of Fortune, and it had all the drivers' names on it. And basically what was you spin the wheel, and then whoever's name it lands on, you have to give a prediction of what position. I got Hamilton for that when I did the Styrian preview, and I said P2. I just thought, well, this is easy. Give me another name, something a bit more challenging. So I thought that was quite fun. Don't worry, Tom. We're not going to steal that. That's your idea. I mean, it did look quite cool. But if you haven't checked his podcast out, I was on there last week to do a Styrian preview and French review, of course. So definitely check that out. And so I think all that's left to say, guys, really. Thanks, Courtney, for coming on, of course, with me.
Well, you know, I love coming on here and talking all things F1 with you, mate. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. But let us know, guys. Let us know who you think is going to come out on top this weekend. Do you think that Max is going to continue being the freight train that he has been at the moment? Of course, with some of his aficionados over from Holland might be making the trip to support him, the old orange wall that Courtney ever so loves so much to see. Might be making an appearance in this race, or will Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes respond? It feels like they have to sooner rather than later. Could it be this weekend? We'll have to wait and see. But until then, guys, if you haven't already, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. If you haven't already, help us get to 400 subscribers and beyond. We want to keep going and going and going, hopefully to 1,000 at some point, maybe this year or next year. But if you're following us on other platforms, thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. And until next time, stay safe, and we will see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. Take care.
See you soon.